What if the gods of ancient Sumerians were never meant to be understood as physical beings? What if they were expressions of memory, symbols created to preserve meaning rather than events? Tonight, we explore a symbolic reading of Sumerian mythology, where gods represent time, cycles, and collective remembrance, not biography or presence. A quiet reflection on how early civilizations remembered the past by transforming it into myth. The night is still, the air is cool, somewhere the world is slowing down, and in that stillness we return to the oldest written words on earth, not to chase mystery, not to uncover secrets, but to ask a quieter question. What if the Sumerians never believed their gods walked among them? What if the names carved into clay were not meant to describe beings, but memories? What if mythology was not a record of the divine, but a way of holding on to time itself? Tonight, we will not speak of gods as rulers. We will not imagine thrones or battles or voices from the sky. Instead, we will consider another possibility, that the divine names preserved in cuneiform were containers, vessels for meaning, symbols that carried the weight of centuries without ever claiming to describe a single moment. This is not a story of revelation. It is a study in how memory works when writing is still young and the past has no fixed shape. If this approach resonates with you, if you value patience over spectacle, you are welcome to join this channel. There is no urgency, only an invitation to think slowly, and if you would like, leave a quiet word in the comments. Where are you listening from? What time is it there? So, let's begin now. Before there were kings, before there were cities, before there were names for the things we now call order, there was something else. The Sumerian texts do not begin with light. They do not begin with a voice calling out across the void. They begin with water, not the water we know, not rivers or rain, but something older, something that has no edges. The texts call it Namu, the primordial sea. Not a goddess in the way we imagine goddesses, not a figure with intention or will, but a presence, a state, the undifferentiated beginning. In the earliest cosmological fragments, there is no creation from nothing. There is no divine command that splits the dark. Instead, there is separation. Something that was unified becomes divided. Sky and earth, which were once joined, are pulled apart, not by violence, not by struggle, but by necessity, by the slow, inevitable movement toward structure. This is not a story of beginnings in the way we expect. It is a story of differentiation, of the world learning to hold its own shape. The texts do not explain why this happened. They do not ask for a reason. They simply record that it did. An, the sky, rises. Kai, the earth, remains below. Between them, something new emerges. Lil, the air, the breath, the space in which things can exist separately. This is not drama. It is architecture. The world is being organized. Not created from nothing, but arranged from what already was, and in that arrangement, meaning begins. The Sumerians did not ask where the water came from. They did not ask what existed before the separation. Those were not the questions that mattered. What mattered was order. What mattered was that the world could be known, that it could be named, that it could be inhabited, and so the names appear. Not as biographies, not as stories, but as principles. Sky, earth, water, air. These are not characters. They are categories, ways of organizing experience, ways of making the world intelligible. The texts were written by scribes, human beings, trained in the temples, trained in the palace schools. Their hands pressed the reed into soft clay, line by line, sign by sign. They were not witnesses to the divine. They were custodians of tradition. Their task was not to invent, it was to preserve. But preservation in the ancient world did not mean recording every detail. It meant stabilizing meaning. The scribes did not write for future generations who would analyze their grammar. They wrote for the present, for continuity, for the maintenance of order in a world that was always threatening to collapse back into formlessness. They recorded rituals, they recorded king lists, they recorded hymns and incantations, and in doing so, they created something we now call mythology. But mythology to them was not fantasy. It was structure. It was the language through which the world made sense. When we read the names of the Sumerian gods today, we bring our own expectations. We imagine personalities. We imagine stories. We imagine beings with desires and conflicts and relationships. But the texts do not always support this. Many of the so-called gods are never described as acting. They are never quoted. They are never shown in motion. They simply exist as names attached to forces. Enki, associated with fresh water and wisdom. Enlil, associated with wind and authority. Inanna, associated with fertility and war. These associations are real. They appear consistently across hundreds of years of writing. But they are not narratives. They are attributions, labels, classifications. The gods, in this reading, are not agents. They are domains. Not rulers of the world, but aspects of it. Sky is not governed by An. Sky is An. Earth is not ruled by Kai. Earth is Ki. The distinction we make between a god and the thing they represent may not have existed in the same way for the people who first wrote these names. This does not mean the Sumerians lacked imagination. It does not mean they had no stories. But it suggests that the stories may have served a different function than we assume. They may have been mnemonic, symbolic, compressed. A way of holding on to meaning when direct memory could no longer be trusted. Consider the passage of time in a world without writing. A generation lives. They remember their parents. Perhaps their grandparents. But beyond that, the details fade. Events blur together. Causes and effects become unclear. What remains is not a timeline. It is a feeling, a sense of how things were. And that feeling must be preserved somehow. So it is encoded, transformed, given shape through symbol. A god's name becomes a way of saying, this is how we understood the world then. Not, this is who ruled us. Not, this is what we saw. But, this is what we carried forward. The Sumerians did not record history the way we do. They did not build chronologies that stretched back to the beginning of time. Their king lists, often cited as historical documents, include reigns of impossible length, 30,000 years, 20,000 years. These are not mistakes. They are not exaggerations meant to impress. They are something else. A way of saying that time, before the flood, before the cities, before the order we now live in, was different, deeper, heavier, not measurable in the way we measure now. The names in those lists may not have been individuals. They may have been epochs, eras, collective memories of long periods compressed into single figures, a name that stands not for one ruler, but for the memory of an age. This is not deception. It is memory functioning in a world where memory and myth are not yet separate. In this framework, the gods are not beings who once lived and then departed. They are not ancient astronauts. They are not lost civilizations. They are not physical entities who left behind traces we can excavate. They are memory itself, crystallized, preserved, encoded in names that could outlast the details they once represented. When the scribes wrote of Enki shaping humanity from clay, they were not recording an event. They were recording a belief about origin, about the relationship between the divine and the mortal, about the way order comes into the world. The story is not literal. But it is not false. It is symbolic. And symbols, for the Sumerians, were not less real than facts. They were more enduring. This is why the gods have no clear biographies, why their stories are fragmented, why the same deity can appear in different contexts with different attributes, and no one saw a contradiction. Because they were never meant to be consistent in the way a person is consistent. They were meant to be flexible, to adapt, to hold meaning across different times and places. A god could represent water in one text and wisdom in another, because the connection between water and wisdom, between fertility and knowledge, was symbolic, fluid, not fixed. The texts do not tell us what the gods did. They tell us what the gods meant. And meaning, unlike action, does not need a sequence. It does not need a plot. It only needs to resonate. When we ask, did the Sumerians really believe in their gods? We're asking the wrong question. Belief, in the modern sense, implies a choice between true and false, between real and imaginary. But the Sumerians did not think in those terms. Their gods were not hypotheses to be tested. They were the framework through which reality was interpreted. To ask if Enlil was real is like asking if the concept of authority is real. It exists, it shapes behavior, it structures society, but it is not a physical thing. It is not a being you can touch. It is a principle, and principles, when they are old enough, when they are important enough, are given names, are personified, are remembered as if they were alive, not because anyone was confused, but because that is how memory works when it must carry the weight of centuries. The myths we have inherited are not the myths as they were first understood. They have been filtered through time, through translation, through interpretation. The Babylonians inherited Sumerian traditions and reshaped them. The Akkadians blended them with their own. The Greeks encountered them centuries later and saw echoes of their own stories. By the time these texts reached us, they had been rewritten dozens of times, each generation adding, subtracting, emphasizing, forgetting. What we read now is not the original. It is the final layer of a palimpsest. And beneath that layer there may be something quieter, something simpler, something that was never meant to be sensational. Modern readers expect mythology to be grand. We expect battles. We expect drama. We expect gods who rage and love and scheme. And when we find fragments of those stories in the Sumerian texts, we assume we have found the core of their belief. But what if those are the additions? What if the drama came later? What if the earliest layer was not narrative at all, but simply names? Names attached to forces, names attached to time, names that said, this is what we remember, this is what mattered. The gods, in this reading, are not the stars of ancient stories. They are the framework, the background, the silent structure that allows the world to make sense. This does not diminish them. If anything, it makes them stranger, more profound. A God who acts is comprehensible. A God who simply is, who exists as a category, as a principle, as a way of organizing the incomprehensible, is something else entirely. It is a God who cannot be met, cannot be seen, cannot be known, only referenced, only invoked, only remembered. And perhaps that is what the Sumerians intended, not to describe the divine, but to preserve its absence, to create names that would endure even after the experiences they represented had vanished completely. The texts do not explain this. They do not say, we are encoding memory. They simply do it, line by line, tablet by tablet. They record hymns that praise gods who never speak. They record rituals that invoke gods who never appear. They record king lists that stretch back into impossible time. And in doing so, they create a mythology that is not about the gods at all. It is about memory, about continuity, about the human need to hold on to meaning even when the details have been lost. If we approach the text this way, many of the contradictions dissolve. Why do some gods appear in multiple roles? Because they represent multiple layers of memory. Why are some myths inconsistent? Because they were never meant to be harmonized. They were independent fragments, preserved side by side, each carrying its own meaning. Why do the gods seem distant, abstract, uninvolved? Because they were never meant to be characters. They were meant to be echoes, traces of something that once was, now encoded in language so it would not disappear entirely. The scribes who recorded these texts were not poets, in the way we understand poets. They were not artists seeking to express their inner vision. They were functionaries, administrators, men trained to serve the temple and the palace. Their education was rigorous. It took years. They learned to read and write in a language that was already ancient by the time they were born. Sumerian, by the 2nd millennium BCE, was no longer spoken in daily life. It had become a sacred language, a language of ritual and record. The scribes who wrote in Sumerian were writing in a tongue that belonged to the past, and perhaps that is why it was chosen. Because the past, for the Sumerians, was not a foreign country. It was the foundation, the source of legitimacy, the proof that order had always existed and could continue to exist. When a scribe carved a hymn to Enlil, he was not composing from inspiration. He was copying, adapting, preserving. The hymn had been sung before. It had been written before. His task was to ensure it would be written again. This is not creative work in the modern sense, but it is sacred work. It is the work of continuity. And continuity, in a world without printing presses, without libraries in the modern sense, without any guarantee that knowledge would survive, was everything. The scribe's hand was the only thing standing between memory and oblivion, between meaning and silence. And so he wrote, slowly, carefully, pressing the reed into the clay, making marks that would harden, that would last, that would carry forward what could not be allowed to fade. The tablets themselves are small. Most of them fit in the palm of a hand. They were not meant to be monumental. They were not meant to impress. They were tools, records, references. A tablet might contain a single incantation, a list of offerings, a fragment of a myth. These were not grand literary works. They were pieces of a larger system, a system designed to keep the world running, to ensure that the rituals were performed correctly, that the gods were addressed properly, that the king's authority was remembered, that the boundaries of fields were not forgotten, that debts were recorded, that time itself did not slip away unnoticed. In this context, the gods are not separate from the system. They are part of it. When a scribe writes the name Enlil, he is not invoking a being who might respond. He is invoking a concept, authority, order, the principle that holds the sky above the earth, the force that ensures the world does not collapse back into chaos. Enlil does not need to act. Enlil does not need to speak. Enlil simply is. And the scribe's task is to preserve that presence, to keep the name alive, to ensure that when the next generation reads the tablet, they will understand what Enlil represents. Not who Enlil was, but what Enlil means. This is why the texts are so repetitive, why the same phrases appear again and again, why entire passages are copied from one tablet to another, with only minor variations. This is not laziness, this is intentional. Repetition is preservation. Repetition is continuity. Each time the phrase is written, it is reinforced. Each time the name is invoked, it is remembered. The goal is not originality. The goal is endurance, and endurance, in the ancient world, required constant renewal. The tablets were fragile. They could break. They could be lost. They could be destroyed. The only way to ensure that knowledge survived was to write it again, and again, and again, until the memory became so deeply embedded in the culture that it could not be erased. The myths we call myths were not entertainment. They were not bedtime stories. They were not moral lessons in the way we understand them. They were structural. They explained why things are the way they are, why the sky is above, why the earth is below, why humans work, why death exists, why the rivers flood, why the seasons change. These are not small questions. They are the questions that every culture must answer if it is to make sense of the world. And the Sumerians answered them not with science, not with philosophy in the Greek sense, but with symbol, with names, with figures that represented forces too large to be understood any other way. Consider the figure of Enki. In many texts, he is associated with fresh water. With the Apsu, the underground ocean that feeds the rivers and springs, he is also associated with wisdom, with craft, with the knowledge of how things work. This is not arbitrary. In the arid landscape of southern Mesopotamia, water is life. Water is survival. Water is the difference between abundance and famine. To control water is to control existence itself. And so the one who understands water, who knows where it flows, who can predict its movements, is the one who possesses wisdom. Enki is not a god who invented wisdom. Enki is the personification of the connection between water and knowledge, between resource and understanding. His myths are not adventures. They are explanations. They say, this is how we think about wisdom. This is how we think about survival. This is how these things are related. When Enki shapes humans from clay in the myth of Atrahasis, he is not performing a historical act. He is expressing a relationship. Humans are of the earth. Humans work the earth. Humans are formed by necessity, by the need for labor, by the god's desire to be free from toil. This is not a story about the past. It is a story about the present, about why humans exist in the relationship they do with the land, with labor, with the divine order. The myth does not need to be true in a factual sense to be meaningful. It needs to resonate. It needs to explain. It needs to give shape to something that would otherwise be formless. And what of the other gods? What of Inanna, who appears in so many texts, whose stories are among the most vivid, whose descent into the underworld is one of the few Sumerian myths that feels like a narrative? Even here we must be careful. Inanna is not consistent. She is goddess of love and goddess of war. She is Venus, the morning star and the evening star. She is fertility and she is destruction. She is celebration and she is mourning. These are not contradictions. They are aspects. Inanna represents the duality of existence. the way beauty and violence are intertwined, the way life and death are not opposites but partners. Her descent into the underworld is not a story about a goddess who died and returned. It is a story about cycles, about the disappearance and return of fertility, about the necessity of loss, about the way the world renews itself through death. The text does not explain this, it simply shows it. Inanna descends. She is stripped of her power. She dies. She is hung on a hook, and then, through cunning, through mourning, through the intervention of others, she returns. But she does not return unchanged. She must leave someone behind. The story ends with substitution, with Dumuzi, her consort, taking her place for half the year. This is not tragedy in the modern sense. It is structure. It is the explanation for why the seasons change, why the land is fertile and then barren, why what is loved must sometimes be surrendered. The myth encodes a truth about the world, not a historical truth, a symbolic truth. The modern mind struggles with this. We want to know what really happened. We want to separate fact from fiction. We want to know if the Sumerians believed these stories literally or understood them as metaphor. But this is a false choice. The Sumerians did not think in those terms. They did not have our categories. Their myths were not literal or metaphorical. They were both. They were neither. They were simply the way things were understood, the way memory was preserved, the way meaning was transmitted from one generation to the next. When we read these texts today, we are reading them through layers of translation and interpretation. We are reading them with modern expectations. We expect plot. We expect character development. We expect resolution. But the Sumerian texts do not always provide these things. They are often fragmentary, often repetitive, often opaque. This is not because they are badly written. It is because they were never written for us. They were written for people who already knew the context, who already understood the references, who did not need everything explained. The tablets were part of a living tradition. They assumed knowledge. They assumed familiarity. They were not designed to stand alone, and yet they have stood alone. The tradition died. The language was forgotten. The rituals ceased. The temples crumbled, and the tablets remained, buried in the sand, waiting. When they were rediscovered in the 19th century, scholars had to rebuild the context from scratch. They had to relearn the language. They had to piece together the fragments. They had to guess at meanings. And in that process of reconstruction, new myths were born. Modern myths. Myths about what the ancient Sumerians believed. Myths that said the Sumerians were visited by advanced beings. Myths that said the gods were astronauts. Myths that said the tablets contained hidden knowledge. These are not ancient myths. These are modern fantasies projected onto ancient texts. The texts themselves are quieter, more modest. They do not claim to reveal cosmic secrets. They claim to preserve order, to maintain continuity, to remember what must not be forgotten. The gods they describe are not aliens. They are not lost civilizations. They are not physical beings who once walked the earth. They are symbols, categories, principles. They are the way the Sumerians organized their understanding of the world, the way they made sense of forces too large to comprehend, the way they remembered time too deep to measure. This does not make them less powerful. If anything, it makes them more profound. A god who is a symbol, who is a category, who is a way of thinking, cannot be disproven, cannot be dismissed, cannot be relegated to the past. Because the forces they represent are still with us. We still experience order and chaos. We still experience fertility and barrenness. We still experience authority and rebellion. We still experience the passage of time. We still struggle to remember. We still struggle to preserve meaning. The gods of Sumer are not dead. They are transformed. They are the ancestors of every system we have built since, every category, every principle, every attempt to make the incomprehensible comprehensible. The Sumerian scribes did not know this. They did not know that their tablets would survive for thousands of years. They did not know that we would read them. They did not know that we would argue about them. They wrote for their own time, for their own purposes, to serve the temple, to serve the king, to maintain the order of the world as they understood it. And in doing so, they created something that outlasted them, something that outlasted their cities, something that outlasted their language. They created memory, not perfect memory, not complete memory, but memory nonetheless. Fragments of a worldview, traces of a way of thinking, names that have survived even though the experiences they represented have vanished. When we read the name Enlil today, we are not encountering a god. We are encountering an echo, a remnant, a symbol that once carried enormous meaning and now carries only the faint trace of that meaning. But the trace is enough. It is enough to remind us that there were people before us, people who thought differently, people who organized the world differently, people who remembered differently, and their memory encoded in clay has reached us, not intact, not complete, but present. This is the paradox of ancient memory. It survives by becoming something other than itself. The tablets were written to preserve specific meanings for specific people in specific contexts. But those contexts are gone. The people are gone. The meanings have shifted. What remains is the form without the content, the name without the experience, the symbol without the referent. And yet, we read, we interpret, we try to reconstruct what was lost. And in that reconstruction we create new meanings, not the original meanings, but meanings that resonate with us. Meanings that help us understand our own relationship to time, to memory, to the past. The Sumerians would not recognize what we have made of their texts. They would not understand our fascination with their gods as personalities. They would not understand our desire to know if the gods were real in a physical sense. They would not understand our need to separate history from myth, fact from symbol. These distinctions did not matter to them. What mattered was that the order held, that the rituals were performed, that the names were remembered, that the world continued. And it did continue. For thousands of years, until it didn't, until the cities fell, until the language died, until the tablets were buried and forgotten. But even in forgetting there is a kind of remembering. The tablets were not destroyed. They were preserved by the very earth they were written about, buried in the mud of the Tigris and Euphrates, protected by the sand, waiting to be found. And when? They were found when they were read again, when the language was deciphered, something was recovered. Not the original experience, not the living tradition, but the trace of it, the shadow of it, the memory of memory. This is what we have inherited. Not the gods themselves, not the beliefs themselves, but the record of how a civilization tried to hold on to meaning, how they tried to preserve what mattered most, how they tried to ensure that their understanding of the world would not vanish completely. And in that record we can see ourselves, we can see our own struggles with memory, our own attempts to preserve meaning, our own fear that what we know, what we value, what we believe, will be lost when we are gone. The Sumerian gods in this reading are not ancient mysteries to be solved. They are ancient strategies to be understood, strategies for dealing with time, with change, with the inevitable erosion of direct experience. When you cannot remember precisely what happened, you remember the pattern. When you cannot remember the details, you remember the meaning. When you cannot remember the individual, you remember the principle. This is not deception. This is adaptation. This is memory doing what memory must do to survive. Consider again the king lists, the reigns that stretch for tens of thousands of years. Modern readers see these and assume error, or myth, or exaggeration. But what if they are none of these? What if they are simply a different way of measuring time, a way that acknowledges that before the flood, before the cities, before the order we recognize, time felt different, moved differently, was experienced differently. The Sumerians are not claiming that individual kings lived for 30,000 years. They are claiming that the era those kings represent, the memory of that time, is immense, too vast to be contained in normal measurements. And so they use numbers that convey weight rather than duration. Numbers that say, this was long ago, this was before, this was the deep time from which we emerged. We have lost the ability to read time this way. We have trained ourselves to think of time as linear, uniform, measurable in consistent units. But time does not feel uniform. Childhood feels eternal. Years pass in moments. Memory compresses decades into images and expands seconds into lifetimes. The Sumerians wrote their king lists the way memory actually works, not the way calendars work. And in doing so, they were more honest about the past than we often are. They admitted that the deep past cannot be measured, cannot be contained, cannot be known in the way we know the present. It can only be gestured toward, only symbolized, only named. The gods serve the same function. They are gestures toward forces too large to be described literally. When the texts say that Enlil separated heaven and earth, they are not describing an event. They are describing the concept of separation itself, the idea that the world has structure, that things have their place, that order exists. Enlil is not the being who did this. Enlil is the principle by which it was done, the name that carries the memory of when formlessness became form, when chaos became cosmos, when the undifferentiated became differentiated. This is why the gods have no origin stories of their own. We are never told where Enlil came from. We are never told how An came to be. We are never told why Namu, the primordial sea, exists, because these are not beings with histories. They are the categories through which history is understood. They are the framework, not the content. To ask where Enlil came from is to ask where the concept of authority came from. The question is meaningless. Authority is not born. It emerges. It is recognized. It is named. And once named, it is remembered. The texts do not explore the psychology of the gods. They do not give us their thoughts, their feelings, their motivations. When gods speak in Sumerian texts, they speak in formulas, in declarations, in commands. There is no interiority, no doubt, no development. This is not because the Sumerians lacked sophistication. It is because the gods were never meant to be psychological beings. They were meant to be voices of order, expressions of cosmic structure. When Enlil commands, he is not expressing a personal desire. He is expressing the necessity of order itself. The command is not arbitrary. It is structural. It is the way things must be for the world to continue. This becomes clearer when we compare Sumerian texts to later Babylonian texts. In the Babylonian Enuma Elish, the gods have personalities. They have conflicts. They have motivations. Marduk rises to power through action, through defeating Tiamat, through proving himself worthy. This is narrative. This is story. But the Sumerian texts that predate it are different. They do not build to a climax. They do not have protagonists and antagonists. They simply describe states, before and after. Separation and order, chaos and structure. The difference is revealing. It suggests that the narrative dimension, the story dimension, was added later, that the original layer was more abstract, more symbolic, more focused on categories than characters. This does not mean the Babylonians corrupted the Sumerian tradition. It means they adapted it. They took the symbolic framework and gave it narrative flesh. They made it into something that could be told, something that could be performed, something that could engage an audience. This is a natural development, but it is a development. It is not the original. And when we read Sumerian texts looking for the kind of narrative we find in later mythology, we're reading them through a lens that obscures their actual nature. The actual nature of Sumerian mythology is not easy to define. It exists at the boundary between record and symbol, between memory and meaning. The texts preserve names, associations, formulas. They preserve the structure of rituals. They preserve hymns that praise divine attributes, but they do not often tell stories in the way we expect stories to be told. When they do include narrative, it is sparse, compressed, elusive. The story of Inanna's descent is one of the few that feels complete, but even there we have multiple versions, multiple fragments, parts that do not quite align. This is not poor preservation. This is the way the tradition worked. There was no single authoritative version. There were variations, local traditions, different emphases. The myth was alive, flexible, adaptable, and then it stopped being alive. The tradition ended. The variations ceased. The text became fixed, dead, buried. And in that death they achieved a kind of immortality. Because they could no longer change, they could be preserved. Because they could no longer adapt, they could be studied. Because they were no longer part of a living culture, they became artifacts, evidence, sources. We read them now, not as participants but as observers. We read them not to perform rituals but to understand worldviews. We read them not to preserve meaning but to recover it. But what do we recover? Not the experience of the ancient Sumerians. That is gone. Not their beliefs in any pure form. Those are inaccessible. What we recover is a way of thinking about thinking, a way of organizing the incomprehensible, a way of giving names to forces that cannot be seen, cannot be touched, cannot be proven, but must nonetheless be acknowledged. The Sumerians knew that the world was larger than human understanding. They knew that forces beyond their control shaped their lives. They knew that time stretched back further than memory could reach. And they responded not with despair but with structure. They named the forces, they categorized them, they gave them attributes, they created a framework through which the overwhelming could be made manageable. This is what mythology does, not just Sumerian mythology, all mythology. It is a technology of meaning, a way of compressing vast complexity into forms that can be transmitted, into names that can be remembered, into stories that can be retold. The content varies, the names change, the specifics shift, but the function remains the same, to make the world intelligible, to preserve what matters, to ensure continuity across generations. The Sumerian gods, then, are not unique in being symbolic. All gods are symbolic. All gods represent something beyond themselves. What makes the Sumerian gods interesting is how early they are, how close to the beginning of writing, how transparent in some ways their symbolic function is. Because the tradition is so old, because the texts are so fragmentary, because we have lost so much context, we can see more clearly what the gods are doing. We can see the machinery of myth before it was polished, before it was refined into the seamless narratives of later cultures. We can see the gods as names, as lists, as attributes attached to cosmic forces, and we can see how those names over time accumulated associations, accumulated stories, accumulated meanings, how they thickened into characters, how they became, gradually, the beings we think of when we think of gods. But at the beginning, they were simpler. They were categories. They were memory made tangible. They were the answer to the question, how do we hold on to meaning when experience fades? The answer the Sumerians found was, we give it a name, we write it down, we repeat it, we preserve it, we pass it on, and if we do this carefully enough, patiently enough, consistently enough, the name will survive. Even when the experience is gone, even when the context is lost, even when the meaning is shifted, the name will remain. And future generations, even if they do not understand us, even if they interpret us differently, even if they make of our words something we never intended, will know that we were here, that we thought, that we remembered, that we tried to hold on to what mattered. This is not immortality in any grand sense. It is modest immortality. The immortality of traces, of fragments, of echoes. But it is enough. The Sumerian tablets have survived for more than 4,000 years. The names they preserve are still read, still studied, still debated. The gods they recorded, whether as beings or as symbols, whether as memories or as myths, are still present. Not in temples, not in worship, but in consciousness, in the long human conversation about meaning, about memory, about how we make sense of the world. And perhaps this was always the intention, not conscious intention, not explicit planning, but an intuition that ran deeper than strategy. The scribes who pressed reed to clay knew their work was important. They knew it would outlast them. They may not have imagined 4,000 years. They may not have imagined different languages, different continents, different ways of understanding the world entirely. But they knew that writing was permanence, that once something was written, it existed in a way that speech never could. It could be copied, stored, retrieved. It could survive the death of memory. It could survive the death of the one who remembered. This is the power of writing. And the Sumerians were among the first to wield it. Before them, memory was only what could be carried in the mind, only what could be passed from mouth to mouth. And with each passing, something was lost, something was changed. The game of telephone played across generations. Writing stopped this. Writing fixed memory, made it stable, made it retrievable. And in doing so, writing changed what memory could be. It allowed memory to be longer, more complex, more detailed. It allowed memory to be public rather than private, shared rather than individual. It allowed memory to become history, but history in the Sumerian sense was not what we call history. It was not a neutral record of events. It was not an attempt to capture the past as it actually was. It was selective, purposeful, ideological. The scribes wrote what needed to be written, what served the temple, what served the king, what maintained order. They did not write personal reflections. They did not write critiques. They did not write alternatives. They wrote orthodoxy. They wrote continuity. They wrote the official memory of the world, and within that official memory the gods had a specific role. They legitimized authority, they explained structure, they provided a cosmic framework for earthly order. When a king claimed to rule by divine mandate, he was not claiming that a god had personally chosen him. He was claiming that his rule was aligned with cosmic order, that his authority was not arbitrary but structural, that he governed according to principles older and larger than himself. The gods were the language through which power was justified, through which hierarchy was naturalized, through which the social order was presented as cosmic necessity. This does not mean the gods were invented cynically. It does not mean the scribes did not believe in them. But it means their belief was embedded in a system. The gods were not abstract theological concepts. They were practical, functional. They did work in the world. They maintained order. They sanctioned rulers. They received offerings. They were invoked in oaths. They punished oath-breakers. They were, in a very real sense, part of the social fabric. To deny the gods was not to deny metaphysical propositions. It was to deny the legitimacy of the entire social order, to step outside the framework, to become unintelligible. This is why the gods could not be questioned. Not because people were forbidden to question, but because there was no language in which to question. The gods were not hypotheses, they were axioms. They were the starting point of all reasoning. To ask if Enlil exists is like asking if authority exists. The question makes no sense. Within the framework that defines the terms, authority exists because we experience it. We name it Enlil. We describe its attributes. We trace its operations. Whether there is a being called Enlil separate from the experience of authority is not a question the framework allows. Modern readers struggle with this because we live in a different framework. We live after the Enlightenment, after the scientific revolution, after the separation of church and state, after the distinction between fact and value, between objective and subjective, between literal and metaphorical. We have been trained to ask questions like, is this true? Is this real? Is this literal or symbolic? But these questions would have been incomprehensible to a Sumerian scribe, not because he was primitive, not because he lacked critical thinking, but because his framework was different. His categories were different. His way of relating to the world was different, and his way was not inferior, it was simply other. It answered different questions, it served different purposes, it made different things possible and different things impossible. Within the Sumerian framework, you could not question whether the gods existed, but you could question which god should receive which offering. You could question whether a ritual was performed correctly. You could question whether a king truly ruled according to divine order or was a usurper. The framework allowed for debate, for interpretation, for disagreement, just not about the existence of the framework itself. This is true of all frameworks. We cannot step outside our own. We cannot question the axioms we use to form questions. We can only work within them. And when we encounter a different framework, from a different time, from a different culture, we inevitably translate it into our own terms. We ask our questions of it. We impose our categories onto it. We make it intelligible to us by making it less itself. This is unavoidable. This is the nature of interpretation. But we can at least be aware that we are doing it. We can at least acknowledge that the Sumerians were not simply us in ancient costume. They thought differently. And their gods are the evidence of that difference. Their gods are not our gods. Even when later cultures inherited Sumerian divine names, even when the Babylonians wrote new myths about Enlil and Enki, even when the names travelled across time and space, they changed, they adapted, they became something new. The Enlil of the Babylonian period is not quite the Enlil of the Sumerian period. The associations have shifted, the emphasis has changed, the narrative has expanded, and by the time these names reach us, filtered through millennia, they have been transformed so many times that the original is barely visible. But barely visible is not invisible. Traces remain. In the repetition of formulas, in the structure of hymns, in the associations of names with natural forces, in the sparseness of narrative, in the emphasis on order over action, in the compression of time, in the encoding of memory. These traces tell us something. Not everything, not even most things, but something. They tell us that the Sumerians understood mythology differently than we do, that their gods served functions we have largely forgotten, that their texts preserved meanings we can only partially reconstruct, and perhaps that is enough. Perhaps we do not need to fully understand the Sumerians to learn from them. Perhaps the very fact that they are partially opaque, that they resist our interpretations, that they remain strange even after centuries of study, is itself valuable. It reminds us that human cultures are diverse, that ways of thinking are not universal, that our own frameworks are not inevitable, that there are other ways to organize experience, other ways to preserve memory, other ways to make meaning. The Sumerian gods, in their strangeness, in their refusal to be easily categorized, in their resistance to our narratives, are a gift. They are a reminder of possibility, of difference, of the vast range of human responses to the fundamental questions of existence. What is order? What is authority? What is time? What is memory? What is worth preserving? The Sumerians answered these questions one way, we answer them another, and between their answers and ours lies a distance that cannot be fully bridged. But it can be acknowledged, it can be respected, it can be studied with humility rather than certainty, with curiosity rather than conclusion, with patience rather than haste. This is the approach that does justice to the texts, not to claim we have decoded them, not to claim we have discovered their secrets, not to claim we have recovered their original meanings, but to claim that we have listened, that we have paid attention, that we have tried to hear what they are saying rather than what we want them to say. And what they seem to be saying when we listen carefully is that the gods were never the point. The point was memory. The point was continuity. The point was the preservation of order in the face of chaos. The point was the human struggle to hold on to meaning when everything conspires to erase it. The gods were the technology through which this was accomplished. They were the names that could be written, the categories that could be taught, the symbols that could be transmitted. They were not the content of memory, but the form of it. Not what was remembered, but how remembering was done. And in that sense, they were not beings at all. They were methods, strategies, solutions to the problem of time. Time erases, time transforms, time takes the vivid and makes it vague, takes the certain and makes it doubtful, takes the known and makes it unknown. This is the enemy the Sumerians faced. Not physical enemies, though they had those. Not hunger or disease or war, though they had those too. But time, the slow erosion of everything, the inevitable fading of experience, the certainty that what is known now will be forgotten later, the fear that meaning will be lost, that order will collapse, that chaos will return. Against this enemy, the Sumerians deployed writing, they deployed ritual, they deployed the gods, not as supernatural beings who would intervene, but as stable points in the flux, as anchors, as reference points, as names that would endure when the things they named had passed. The gods were memory externalized, made public, made permanent, made transmissible. They were the answer to the question, how do we make meaning last? And the answer worked. For thousands of years the answer worked. The gods were copied, the tablets were preserved, the rituals were performed, the names were spoken, the order held, until it didn't, until the cities fell, until the language died, until the tablets were buried. But even in burial, even in silence, even in the long darkness of forgetting, the tablets survived. The names survived. The memory in however attenuated a form survived. And when the tablets were found again, when the language was deciphered, when the names were read once more, something was recovered. Not the Sumerians themselves, not their living culture, but their strategy, their method, their way of fighting time. We are still fighting time. We are still trying to preserve meaning. We are still creating names, symbols, categories through which to organize the overwhelming complexity of existence. We do it differently. We have different technologies, different frameworks, different gods, or no gods at all. But the problem is the same. Time erases. Memory fades. Meaning must be actively preserved or it will be lost. The Sumerians knew this, and their response, encoded in clay, has reached us, not as instruction, not as revelation, but as example, as evidence that the problem is old, that others have faced it, that solutions are possible, that meaning can endure even if imperfectly, even if transformed, even if barely recognizable across vast stretches of time. The clay tablets are silent now. They sit in museums, behind glass, under artificial light. They are no longer alive in the way they once were. No one performs the rituals they describe. No one speaks the incantations they preserve. No one makes offerings to the gods they name. The tablets have become historical objects, curiosities, evidence of a world that no longer exists, and yet they still speak. Not in the language they were written in. Most people cannot read cuneiform. Most people will never see the tablets themselves, but the ideas they contain, the strategies they encode, the memory they preserve, these have spread. These have been translated, these have entered the larger human conversation about who we are and where we come from. When we say that the Sumerians invented writing, we are acknowledging a debt. We are acknowledging that something we now take for granted, something so fundamental to our lives that we cannot imagine existence without it, had a beginning, had inventors, had a moment when it did not exist and then did. Writing seems natural to us, but it is not natural. It is a technology, an invention, a human creation, and the Sumerians were among those who created it. They did not create it to write literature. They did not create it to express themselves. They created it to keep records, to track grain, to record debts, to maintain order. Writing began as accounting, as administration, as control. But once writing existed, it could be used for other things. It could be used to record hymns, to preserve myths, to copy king lists, to encode the names of gods. The technology, once invented, exceeded its original purpose. It became something more than a tool for management. It became a tool for memory, and memory, once externalized, once fixed in physical form, could accumulate, could compound, could build on itself in ways that oral memory never could. Writing made civilization possible. Not because civilizations cannot exist without writing, but because complex, hierarchical, administratively sophisticated civilizations require memory that exceeds what individuals can hold. They require records, archives, references. They require the ability to defer memory, to store it, to retrieve it later, to pass it on intact. The Sumerian gods, in this context, are part of the early archive. They are among the first things that were written down not for practical administrative purposes, but for cultural preservation. The early tablets record business transactions, quantities of grain, allocations of labour, lists of goods. But relatively quickly, within a few centuries of writing's invention, we also find religious texts, hymns, incantations, fragments of myths. The technology that began as accounting became a tool for preserving sacred knowledge, for maintaining ritual, for encoding the cosmic order. Writing allowed the religious tradition to be stabilized, to be checked, to be reproduced accurately, and in doing so, writing changed religion, made it more formal, more fixed, more institutional. Before writing, religious tradition was fluid. It existed in performance, in ritual enacted, in stories told, in songs sung. Each performance was unique. Each telling could vary. There was no original to compare against, no standard to maintain. Tradition existed in practice, not in text. But once tradition was written, it became a thing that could be referred to, a thing that could be cited, a thing that could be judged as correct or incorrect. Writing created orthodoxy, not immediately, not completely, but gradually. Over time, the written version became authoritative, became the reference point, became the standard against which practice was measured. This changed what it meant to be a scribe. Early scribes were simply people who could write. They were technicians, accountants, administrators. But as writing expanded to include religious texts, scribes became something more. They became custodians of sacred knowledge, interpreters of divine will, mediators between the human and the cosmic. To be able to read the texts that contain the names of gods, the formulas of rituals, the hymns of praise was to have access to power. Not political power, though scribes often served kings, but cultural power, the power to say what the tradition was, what the gods required, what the rituals meant. And this power was exercised carefully. Scribes did not innovate, they did not invent, they copied, they preserved, they transmitted. Their task was to ensure that what was written remained written, that the tradition did not drift, that the names did not change, that the formulas stayed intact. This is conservative work. In the literal sense, it conserves, it maintains, it resists change, and for a culture that valued order above all, that saw chaos as the constant threat, this was essential work. The scribes were the guardians of stability, the protectors of continuity, the human agents through which cosmic order was maintained on Earth. But they were still human, and humans make errors. Tablets break, memory fails, texts are lost. And so the scribes had to constantly work against entropy. They had to recopy texts before the originals deteriorated. They had to reconstruct broken tablets. They had to maintain libraries, archives, collections. They had to train new scribes, pass on the knowledge, ensure that the next generation could read what the previous generation had written. This was not a simple task. Cuneiform is complex, it takes years to learn. And Sumerian, by the 2nd millennium BCE, was a dead language. Learning it was like learning Latin in the medieval period. Difficult, technical, requiring dedication, but necessary. Because without scribes who could read Sumerian, the old text would become illegible. The old knowledge would be lost. The connection to the past would be severed. And eventually it was severed. Eventually there were no more scribes trained in Sumerian. Eventually the language was forgotten. The tablets were abandoned. The libraries crumbled. And for 2,000 years no one could read the texts. No one could speak the names of the gods. No one remembered what the symbols meant. The tradition ended, not suddenly, not dramatically, but gradually, through neglect, through the slow accumulation of political changes, religious transformations, linguistic shifts. The world that created the tablets moved on, became something else, and the tablets were left behind, but they were not destroyed. They were buried, preserved by accident, by abandonment, by the simple fact that baked clay, when buried in dry earth, can last for millennia. And so the tablets waited, in the ruins of Ur, in the mounds of Nippur, in the dust of Uruk. They waited for someone who could read them again, someone who cared what they said, someone who would take the time to reconstruct the language, to rebuild the grammar, to recover the meanings, and eventually that someone came. Archaeologists, linguists, scholars. In the 19th century, cuneiform was deciphered, Sumerian was reconstructed, the tablets were read again, and the gods spoke once more, but they spoke differently. They spoke to a world that had no living memory of them, no cultural context, no ritual practice. They spoke as artifacts, as historical evidence, as texts to be analysed, translated, compared, interpreted. The gods were no longer believed in, they were studied, and in that study they became something new. They became objects of academic inquiry, subjects of debate, evidence for theories about ancient religion, about mythology, about the origins of civilization. They became data. This is not what the scribes intended. The scribes wrote for worshippers, for priests, for kings. They wrote to maintain order, not to provide data for future scholars. But intention does not control, meaning, once a text is written, once it enters the world, it can be read in ways the author never imagined. It can serve purposes the author never intended. It can mean things the author never meant. This is the nature of writing. It escapes authorial control. It becomes public, open to interpretation, available to anyone who can read. And so the Sumerian gods, written to preserve cosmic order, have become material for scholarly articles, for museum exhibits, for popular books about ancient aliens, for documentaries about lost civilizations, for videos about history and sleep. They have been reinterpreted, reimagined, recontextualized. They have been claimed by New Age spirituality, by alternative history, by academic specialization, by atheist critique of religion, by comparative mythology. They have been made to mean many things, most of which the original scribes would not recognize. Is this a betrayal? Is this a distortion? Or is this simply what happens when memory outlives the culture that created it? When symbols are separated from their original context and must find new contexts in which to exist. The gods were always symbols. They were always containers for meaning. The meanings have changed. The containers remain. And perhaps this is enough. Perhaps this is what the scribes were creating, even if they did not know it. Not fixed meanings, but stable forms, names that could travel, symbols that could endure, categories that could be filled with new content in new times. The gods are still doing the work they were designed to do. They are still helping humans organize the incomprehensible, make sense of deep time, preserve memory across impossible distances. The content has changed. We no longer worship Enlil. We no longer make offerings to Enki. But we still use the idea of gods, the category of the divine, the concept of cosmic order, to think about our place in the universe. We still struggle with the same questions. What is order? What is authority? What is time? What is meaning? And we still create names, symbols, frameworks through which to approach these questions. The Sumerians were not unique in creating gods. Every culture has done this. Every culture has needed symbols for forces too large to comprehend. But the Sumerians were among the first to write their gods down, to fix them, to make them permanent. And in doing so, they created a record that has survived longer than their cities, their language, their culture. The gods have outlived the civilization that created them. And in that survival, there is a kind of vindication. The strategy worked. Memory was preserved. Not perfectly, not completely, but sufficiently. Sufficiently that we, thousands of years later, can still read the names, can still study the texts, can still try to understand what it meant to live in a world where the gods were not distant metaphysical concepts, but the very structure of reality itself. We cannot fully enter that world. We cannot think like the Sumerians thought. We cannot believe like they believed. But we can recognize that their world was coherent, that their beliefs made sense within their framework, that their gods served real purposes, that their myths preserved real memories, even if not in the form we expect. We can acknowledge that they were not primitive, not naive, not confused. They were simply different. And difference, when approached with respect rather than condescension, can teach us, not facts about the past, but possibilities for thinking, ways of organizing experience, alternatives to our own assumptions. The Sumerian gods, read as memories rather than beings, reveal one such alternative. They reveal a culture that understood memory as something that must be actively preserved, that cannot be taken for granted, that requires technology, requires ritual, requires institutions, requires constant effort. They reveal a culture that knew it was fighting time, that knew its knowledge was fragile, that knew it could be lost. And so they wrote, they encoded, they preserved, they created symbols that would outlast experience, names that would survive when the things they named were forgotten, and in this they succeeded. The names have survived: Enlil, Enki, Inanna, Anorki, Namu. These are not empty sounds. They still carry weight, still carry association, still carry the trace of the forces they were meant to represent. When we read these names today, we are reading across a gap of 4,000 years, across the death of a language, across the collapse of a civilization, across transformations in how humans think, write, organize knowledge, understand the world. And yet, the names reach us, damaged, fragmentary, incomplete, but present. This presence is not mystical, it is not supernatural, it is simply the result of durability. Clay lasts, writing persists, and human curiosity, the desire to know what came before, ensures that when ancient texts are discovered, they will be read. The Sumerian gods have survived because clay survives, because archaeologists dig, because scholars translate, because institutions preserve, because there is a continuous chain of human effort connecting the scribe who first pressed the reed to clay, to the reader who encounters the translation today. That chain is tenuous. It has been broken and repaired many times, but it exists, and through it, memory flows, imperfectly, partially, but persistently. The gods, then, are not supernatural survivors. They are material survivors. They exist in the physical traces they left behind, in tablets, in cylinder seals, in temple ruins, in the very shape of the cuneiform signs that spell their names. These are not spirits, these are objects, and objects, when cared for, can last indefinitely. The gods have survived because we have chosen to preserve them, not as objects of worship, but as objects of study, as evidence, as heritage, as part of the human story. And in that preservation we are continuing the work the scribes began. We are fighting time. We are resisting erasure. We are ensuring that what was known once is not forgotten completely. But what was known? What did the Sumerians actually know about their gods? This is the question that haunts all study of ancient religion. We have the texts, we have the names, we have the associations, but we do not have access to belief. We do not have access to experience. We do not know what it felt like to live in a world structured by these categories. We do not know what it meant experientially to invoke Enlil, to make offerings to Inanna, to participate in rituals dedicated to Enki. We can describe the actions, we can translate the words, but we cannot recreate the meaning those actions and words had for the people who performed them. This is the limit of historical knowledge. We can recover practices, we can recover texts, but we cannot recover consciousness. We cannot know what it was like to be a Sumerian priest, a Sumerian farmer, a Sumerian scribe. We can make educated guesses, we can draw analogies to other cultures, we can use anthropological models, but we cannot achieve certainty. The inner life of the past is lost, only its external traces remain, and from those traces we must reconstruct, carefully, tentatively, with full awareness that our reconstructions are shaped by our own assumptions, our own categories, our own needs. This is why modern interpretations of Sumerian mythology vary so widely. Some scholars see the gods as personifications of natural forces, others see them as deified ancestors, others see them as political symbols, others see them as psychological projections. Each interpretation is plausible, each is supported by some evidence, but none can be proven, because the evidence is incomplete, because the texts do not explain themselves, because we are always reading from outside the culture, always translating not just words but entire frameworks of meaning. The interpretation offered here that the gods are memories is one possibility among many. It is not the only way to read the texts. It is not necessarily the way the Sumerians themselves would describe what they were doing. But it is a way that makes sense of certain features of the mythology, the lack of clear narratives, the emphasis on names and attributes rather than actions, the compression of time, the connection between gods and domains rather than gods and stories. These features are consistent with the idea that the gods were primarily mnemonic, that they were ways of remembering, ways of organizing information, ways of preserving meaning across time. But even if this interpretation is correct, it does not exhaust the meaning of the gods. The gods were many things. They were mnemonic devices. But they were also ritual objects. They were also political symbols. They were also expressions of cosmic order. They were also, perhaps in ways we cannot fully recover, objects of genuine religious feeling, of awe, of reverence, of fear. The gods may have been memories, but they were powerful memories, memories that shaped lives, that structured societies, that gave meaning to existence. To reduce them to any single function is to misunderstand them. The gods were polysemic. They meant many things simultaneously. They operated on many levels at once. This is true of all powerful symbols. A flag is a piece of cloth. But it is also a symbol of national identity, an object of loyalty, a focus of ritual, a marker of territory, a political statement. To say it is only cloth is true but inadequate. To say it is only a symbol is also true but inadequate. It is both, and neither. It exceeds any single description. The Sumerian gods are similar. They are names, they are categories, they are memories, they are political tools, they are ritual focuses, they are cosmic principles, they are all of these and more, and any attempt to define them completely will fail, because they are, like all truly powerful symbols, irreducible. This irreducibility is part of what makes them endure. If they meant only one thing, they would have been replaced when that meaning became irrelevant. But because they meant many things, because they were flexible, because they could be reinterpreted, they survived longer than they otherwise would have. The gods adapted. They changed. They were inherited by the Babylonians and given new stories. They were encountered by the Greeks and recognized as familiar. They were translated into other languages and other mythologies, and each time something was lost. But something was also preserved. The core remained, the name, the association, the basic framework, and that was enough to allow continuity, until it wasn't, until the continuity broke, until the last person who could read Sumerian died, until the last ritual dedicated to Enlil was performed, until the tablets were buried and forgotten, and then, for 2,000 years, the gods were truly silent, not reinterpreted, not adapted, not translated, simply absent, gone from human consciousness, existing only as buried objects, waiting. This is the other side of memory, not preservation but loss. For all our efforts, for all our technologies, most of the past is lost. Most of what humans have thought, said, done, created, believed, has vanished without trace. The Sumerian texts that survive are a tiny fraction of what was written, and what was written is a tiny fraction of what was known. and what was known is a tiny fraction of what was experienced. The gods we read about in the tablets are the gods that happen to be written down, that happen to be copied, that happen to be stored in locations that were later excavated. But there were other gods, other names, other meanings that were never written, or were written and lost, or were written and have not yet been found. The archive is incomplete. It will always be incomplete. This is the nature of historical knowledge. And yet incomplete knowledge is still knowledge. Partial memory is still memory. The fact that we do not know everything does not mean we know nothing. The tablets we have are real. The names they preserve are real. The meanings we can reconstruct, however tentative, are grounded in evidence. We are not simply projecting onto a blank screen. We are reading, interpreting, reconstructing, with all the limitations that implies, but also with all the possibilities. Because even partial knowledge can illuminate, even fragmentary memory can teach, even incomplete text can reveal patterns, structures, ways of thinking that are valuable precisely because they are different from our own. The Sumerian gods, fragmentary as they are, reveal a different relationship to time, a different understanding of memory, a different way of organizing knowledge. They reveal a culture that knew it was vulnerable to forgetting, that knew its knowledge was not secure, that knew it had to work constantly to preserve what mattered, and so they developed technologies, writing, copying, archiving, ritual, education, institutions, all designed to fight entropy, to resist forgetting, to ensure continuity. And those technologies, in various forms, are still with us. We are still writing, still copying, still archiving, still fighting the same battle against time. The tools have changed, the scale has changed, but the struggle is the same. In this sense, the Sumerian gods are not just ancient. They are contemporary, not because we believe in them, not because we worship them, but because the problem they were designed to solve is still our problem. We are still trying to preserve memory, still trying to transmit knowledge across generations, still trying to ensure that what we have learned, what we have discovered, what we value, will not be lost when we are gone. We use different methods, different technologies, different institutions, but the goal is the same, and in that commonality there is a connection, a thread that links us to the scribes who first wrote the names of the gods, a shared human concern, a shared human struggle. The gods are witnesses to that struggle. They are evidence that it is old, that it is fundamental, that it is not unique to our time. Every generation faces the problem of memory. Every generation must choose what to preserve and what to let go. Every generation must develop technologies and practices for fighting forgetting. The Sumerians chose to write, to create archives, to train scribes, to build institutions, and for thousands of years their choice worked. The memory was preserved, the knowledge was transmitted, the order was maintained, until it wasn't, until the system collapsed, until the memory was lost. But even lost memory can be recovered. The tablets were found, the language was deciphered, the gods were read again, not as they were originally read, not with the original meanings, but as something, as evidence, as traces, as echoes of a world that once was. And in that recovery there is hope. Hope that memory once created is never entirely lost, that it can be buried and still survive, that it can be forgotten and still be found again, that the human effort to preserve meaning is not futile, that what we write, what we record, what we encode will outlast us. Perhaps not forever, perhaps not intact, but long enough to matter, long enough to be found by future generations who will read our words and try to understand what we meant, what we valued, what we remembered. The Sumerian gods are a message from the deep past, not a message with clear content, not a message with instructions or revelations, but a message that says, we were here, we thought, we remembered, we tried to preserve what mattered, and though our civilization has fallen, though our language is dead, though our world is gone, this remains. These names, these symbols, these traces, read them if you can, interpret them as you will. But know that we tried. We tried to make meaning last. We tried to fight time. We tried to ensure that something of us would survive, and something has survived. Not the Sumerians themselves, not their beliefs in any pure form, not their experience of the world, but their effort, their strategy, their names, and perhaps that is what the gods always were. Not beings, not even memories of beings, but the effort itself, the human effort to create forms that will endure, to give names to forces too large to comprehend, to organize the incomprehensible into categories that can be transmitted, to fight the inevitable erosion of everything. The effort continues. We are still creating names, still building categories, still developing technologies to preserve memory. We have moved beyond clay tablets. We have digital archives, databases, cloud storage, technologies that can hold more information than 1,000 Sumerian libraries, technologies that can transmit knowledge instantly across the entire world, technologies that seem to promise that forgetting is no longer necessary, that everything can be preserved, that memory can be perfect, complete, permanent. But this is an illusion. Digital memory is fragile in different ways than clay tablets. It depends on electricity, on functioning systems, on maintained infrastructure, on formats that remain readable, on institutions that continue to exist. A clay tablet once baked needs nothing. It simply endures. It can sit in the ground for 4,000 years and still be readable when discovered. But a digital file can become unreadable in a decade, when the software changes, when the format becomes obsolete, when the storage medium degrades, when the institutions that maintain the servers disappear. Digital memory feels permanent, but it requires constant maintenance, constant migration, constant care. Without that care, it vanishes instantly, completely, more thoroughly than any clay tablet ever could. We are learning this. We are learning that preservation is not a solved problem, that new technologies create new vulnerabilities, that memory still requires effort, still requires institutions, still requires people who care enough to maintain the systems, to migrate the data to ensure that what matters is not lost. The problem the Sumerians faced has not gone away. It has only changed shape, and in changing shape, it has perhaps become more urgent. Because we now produce so much information, so much content, so much data, that preservation becomes a problem of selection, of curation, of deciding what matters enough to maintain, what can be allowed to fade, what must be kept. The Sumerians did not have this problem. They had the opposite problem. They had too little writing technology, not too much. Every tablet required effort. Every sign had to be pressed by hand. Every text was precious because production was difficult. But we have the opposite situation. Production is nearly effortless, but preservation of everything is impossible. And so we must choose. We must curate. We must decide what future generations will inherit, what they will be able to remember about us, what version of our world we will transmit. And in this choosing, we're doing what the Sumerian scribes did. We're deciding what constitutes the official memory, what represents our time, what matters enough to preserve. This is not neutral work. This is not objective. Every choice to preserve is also a choice not to preserve something else. Every emphasis is also a de-emphasis. Every archive is also a forgetting. The scribes knew this. They did not preserve everything. They preserved what served the temple, what served the king, what maintained order, and we do the same. We preserve what serves our institutions, our values, our sense of what matters. Future generations will inherit not the totality of our world, but our selection from it, our version, our emphasis, and they will interpret that inheritance in their own way. Just as we have interpreted the Sumerian inheritance, they will read our texts through their own frameworks, their own assumptions, their own needs. They will make of us something we did not intend, something we cannot predict, something that will be partially us and partially them. This is inevitable. This is the nature of transmission across time. Meaning does not remain stable. It shifts. It adapts. It is remade by each generation that encounters it. The gods were remade many times, by the Babylonians, by the Greeks, by modern scholars, by alternative historians, by spiritual seekers. Each remaking is different. Each emphasizes different aspects. Each creates a different version of what the gods mean, and each version has its own validity. Not historical validity necessarily, not accuracy to the original, but validity as a human response to the symbols, as an attempt to make meaning from the fragments, as an interpretation that serves some need, answers some question, fills some gap. The gods are now many things: academic subjects, spiritual symbols, pop culture references, historical curiosities, sources for fiction, evidence in theories about ancient aliens, materials for meditation videos. Each use is different, each meaning is different, but each is a continuation of the god's existence. Each keeps the names alive, keeps the symbols circulating, keeps the memory in however transformed a state present. Is this what the Sumerian scribes intended? Of course not. They could not have imagined any of this. They wrote for their own time, for their own purposes. But once written, once preserved, once transmitted, the texts escaped their control, became available for uses they never imagined, became raw material for meanings they never intended. This is the paradox of preservation. You can preserve the form, but you cannot preserve the meaning. Meaning is always remade, always reinterpreted, always adapted to new contexts. The best you can do is preserve the form strongly enough that it remains available for reinterpretation, that it survives long enough to be discovered by those who will make of it something new. The Sumerian scribes did this. They preserved the form strongly enough, they wrote clearly enough, they copied often enough, they stored carefully enough, and so the forms survived. And we have found them, and we have made of them something new, something they did not intend, but something that carries forward, in however attenuated a form, their effort, their struggle against time, their attempt to make meaning last. We are the proof that their attempt succeeded, not perfectly, not completely, but sufficiently that their names are still known, their texts are still read, their gods are still discussed. 4,000 years later, 4,000 years is a long time, long enough for empires to rise and fall, for languages to be born and die, for technologies to be invented and forgotten and invented again, for entire worldviews to emerge and be replaced, for the earth itself to change, for coastlines to shift, for cities to be buried under sand. And yet, through all this change, the tablets endured, the names endured, not because they were magical, not because they were protected by divine intervention, but because clay lasts, because writing persists, because humans, when they find ancient texts, are curious enough to try to read them. This is not mystical, this is material, this is physical, this is the result of properties of matter and properties of human psychology. But the result is what matters, and the result is memory, fragile, incomplete, transformed, but present. And what does this memory tell us? What do the gods, readers' memories, reveal? They reveal that the past was different, that people thought differently, that there are other ways to organize experience, other ways to understand the world, other ways to create meaning. They reveal that mythology is not primitive science, not failed explanation, not confusion, but a different kind of knowledge, symbolic knowledge, categorical knowledge, knowledge that works through association and metaphor rather than through logic and evidence, knowledge that is not less sophisticated than scientific knowledge, but differently sophisticated, serving different purposes, answering different questions. They reveal that memory is active work, that it requires effort, that it requires technology, that it requires institutions, that it does not happen automatically, that what is not actively preserved will be lost, that forgetting is the default state, and remembering is the achievement. They reveal that writing changed everything, that the ability to externalize memory, to fix it, to store it, to transmit it, transformed human culture in ways that are still unfolding, that we are still living in the world that writing created, still dealing with the possibilities and problems it introduced. They reveal that meaning is not stable, that it changes over time, that what a symbol means to its creators is not what it means to later interpreters, that this instability is not a flaw but a feature, that symbols survive precisely because they can be reinterpreted, because they can adapt, because they can mean different things in different contexts, that rigidity is death and flexibility is life, that the gods survived not because their meaning was fixed, but because it could change. They reveal that we are not so different from the Sumerians, that we face the same problems, that we use different tools but pursue the same goals, that the struggle against time, against forgetting, against the erosion of meaning is universal, that every generation must take up this struggle anew, that there is no final victory, no permanent solution, only the ongoing effort to preserve what matters, to transmit what we have learned, to ensure that something of us will survive. The gods are no longer beings, perhaps they never were. But they are still doing work. They are still teaching, still revealing, still connecting us to the deep past, still reminding us of what is at stake in the struggle to preserve memory. They are no longer worshipped, but they are still studied, still discussed, still present in human consciousness. And that presence, that continued existence in thought, in text, in conversation, is a kind of immortality, not the immortality of unchanging existence, but the immortality of ongoing reinterpretation, of continued relevance, of persistent meaning. The night is quiet now, the world has slowed, and in this stillness we can hear the echoes, not voices from the past, not messages from the gods, but the sound of human effort across vast stretches of time, the sound of reed pressed into clay, of signs carefully formed, of tablets stored and copied and preserved, of memory made permanent, of meaning given form, of the struggle against forgetting. The Sumerians are gone, their cities are dust, their language is silent, but their effort remains, their strategy remains, their names remain, and in those names we can still read the memory of a world that once was, a world that tried to hold on to what mattered, that tried to make meaning last, that tried to ensure that something would survive, and something has survived. Not everything, not even most things, but something. These names, these symbols, these traces, they have reached us across 4,000 years, damaged, fragmentary, incomplete, but present. And that presence is enough to remind us that we are part of a long chain, a chain of humans trying to remember, trying to preserve, trying to transmit, a chain that stretches from the first Sumerian scribe to this moment, a chain that will continue beyond us, into futures we cannot imagine, where others will read what we have written, will try to understand what we meant, will make of our words something we did not intend, will continue the work, the endless work, the necessary work, the work of fighting time. The gods were memories, perhaps they still are, not memories of events, not memories of beings, but memories of effort, of the human attempt to make meaning last, of the struggle to preserve what matters, of the ongoing work of fighting forgetting. And in that work we are all scribes, we are all custodians, we are all part of the chain, writing, preserving, transmitting, hoping that what we write will survive, that it will be found, that it will be read, that something of what we meant will reach those who come after, not perfectly, not completely, but sufficiently, enough to matter, enough to connect, enough to say, we were here, we thought, we remembered, and we tried to make it last. The quiet deepens, the darkness settles, and in that settling there is peace, not the peace of completion, not the peace of final answers, but the peace of effort made, of work done, of memory preserved as well as it can be. The Sumerian gods rest now, not in temples, not in worship, but in tablets, in translations, in thoughts, in the ongoing conversation about meaning and memory and time. They rest as symbols rest, as categories rest, as names rest, ready to be invoked again, ready to be reinterpreted again, ready to continue their work of connecting the present to the past, of reminding us that we are not the first, that others have struggled as we struggle, that the work is old and necessary and endless, and that is enough.